Hi, everybody. Happy almost weekend. We will go ahead and do the adolescent subcultures lecture here. And I think that we had actually started this in class um, before we took this break. So I'm pretty sure I'm just going to flip through these first two slides, first couple slides here. I'm pretty sure we defined subculture. We talked what the values were of hedonism and irresponsibility. And then we had started, I don't think we got to this part, adolescent style. So I'm talking about some parts of adolescent subcultures. So what are the things about style? So first of all, image. I may have talked about this, but we know that teenagers tend to look different than adults. They wear different hairstyles, they have different ways of dressing, they tend to wear more jewelry, have maybe more piercings than adults do. So the whole image thing are things that are worn by some young people, but rarely adults. It helps to distinguish adults from adolescents. And then demeanor, this is an interesting one to study. Different forms of gestures, gait, postures. For example, especially I see adolescent boys doing this, when they see each other, they'll fist bump. Girls will tend to stand, and I realize these are stereotypical here, but they may stand closer together. The posture and the gait tends to be a little bit more informal for adolescents than it is for adults. Certain kinds of handshakes or ways of greeting each other. All those are part of adolescent subculture. And then this next one, argot. This one to me is the most interesting one. This involves the type of words that adolescents use, the vocabulary they use, their language, their manner of speaking. So some of the things that teenagers say that you probably wouldn't hear adults say. And when you think about the argot, the common language for adolescents today, so I'd like for y'all to just stop and think for a minute about some of the words that you hear teenagers today use that you probably wouldn't hear adults. So just off the top of my head, a couple things I'm thinking is the phrase "I can't even," or grind. Sometimes you'll hear turn up. Sometimes you'll hear. These are just things that you're not going to likely hear adults saying. Um, yes. So one of the fun things I did was to look up what the slang was when I was growing up. Now, I was a teenager in the 1980s, admittedly. And so some of the things that we used to say, that some of the words are so funny, like awesome. I mean, we still use awesome. Um, Bodacious, bogus, all those. I have this whole list I would read you. So all those mean things that are bad. For sure. The 80s was the season of the Valley Girl, if you've ever heard of that. So for sure is just stressing what you're saying. Gag me or gag me with a spoon. We used to say stuff like that. Gnarly. Word like is on here, and of course, people still use that just tremendously as a filler word. Rad or radical, which means good. Spazzing, stop spazzing out, which means too excited. To the max, and totally tubular. So all those were ways of saying, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So if you really wanted to be out there, you would say totally tubular to the max. It just sounds totally ridiculous now. But so think about some of the things that you hear adolescents say that really distinguish them from adults. When you get a chance, I'm going to put this lecture on our Blackboard page under unrecorded lectures, and I can't, with the microphone I'm using, link to the YouTube video I want you to watch very well. So go ahead over there and click on this and take a look at it. It basically just talks about teenagers today and some of the words that they use. And it's really funny because it's like a person on the street kind of thing, and they ask them to define it. Like, what does that mean? And some of them don't even know. It's pretty funny. So the question is, how do these youth cultures develop? How does this happen? Because each form of image, demeanor, argot, they symbolize certain values and beliefs that distinguish youth culture from adult culture. So they tend to develop in modern societies, particularly in individualistic societies, oftentimes as a result of that individualism. So it provides teenagers with opportunities to really experiment with different identities, which is obviously a positive thing. Youth culture, youth subculture doesn't necessarily exist as an opposition or rebellion to adult societies. So nobody's saying, we don't want to be an adult, we don't approve of the way adults behave, so we're going to behave this way. But it's just a way of allowing themselves to be an individual. Because as we talked about with identity, this is really a time of individuation and trying to figure out who they are. So depending on the particular group that teenagers belong to, they may participate in a subculture to different degrees or maybe not even at all. So the next couple of slides present the results from that little survey that I put on Blackboard for you all. So I just want to show you the kinds of ways that y'all scored. It was interesting. And originally I had envisioned this to be a Mentimeter slide if we're going to be together. So 11 of you responded to the survey out of like, I don't know, 15 or 16. And to the first question, what else do you do when you're studying besides studying? This was interesting to me. So about half of you said you also listen to music, which is no surprise. About half of you are watching videos and TV, which is probably more distracting than even music when you're studying. 81% of you, the majority of you, are texting or chatting with your friends, and I'm happy to say that 0% of you, of those sampled, reported that you're trying to play games. So remember when we talked about attention, this is definitely divided attention. This is definitely multitasking, which, as we've discussed, interferes with studying. So just saying. Okay, next question. Which types of social media do you use regularly? And the vast majority of you are on Instagram, it looks like, 90%. Over half of you are on Facebook, which surprised me. I thought that really had fallen in popularity among younger people, which, I mean, maybe that's really down, but more than I thought. Most of you are on Snapchat, a little over half on Twitter, and then I forgot to ask about YouTube. I never consider YouTube to be a social media, but I guess it is to some people. So no surprises there. How many hours per day do you spend approximately looking at your phone? Now, I do want to tell you that most people, studies have found that most people underestimate this. And you know you've got that little thing on your phone that tells you. So if you've ever paid attention to that, you have a better idea. So between 0 and 3 hours, 18% of you, that's pretty respectable. Between 3 and 6 is most of you, 63%. Between 6 and 8, 9%, and then over 8 hours a day, 9%. So those of you that admitted those higher hours, I commend you for your honesty, but obviously that's a lot of time on the phone. Then how much discomfort would you feel if you had to be without your phone for a day? 9% of you said, nope, it wouldn't bother me, which is, I think, is amazing. Most of you, 63%, said you would feel mild discomfort, but then almost 20% of you said, yeah, I'd feel quite a bit, and 9% said extreme discomfort. So we're going to talk in this chapter a little bit about that. And then how often do you binge watch TV shows? Once or twice a month, about a third of you. Weekly, almost half of you. And then almost daily, about 18% of you. So that's pretty amazing given your study schedules that you're able to do that. And then finally, what are your feelings about your media use? So about a third of you said it's fine, not too much, not too little. About half of you said you would like to cut back some. And about 18% of you said you want to cut back, quite a bit. So that these are people that are more concerned about their media use. So again, I commend you for your self-description here. Okay, well, what we're going to talk about in this chapter on adolescent subculture. Okay, sorry, I just had to pause for a minute. The main topic that we're going to be discussing in this chapter on subcultures is adolescent media use, both digital screen media, we're going to talk about TV, and we're going to talk about computer games. There are other types of media that are important, for example, music, but just in the interest of time, we're going to stick to the screen media because honestly, right now, that's where all the research is being poured into, investigating that topic. So let's first take a look at how widely available media is to adolescents. And this is coming from a survey that's just a couple of years old. And this survey finds that 99% of American adolescents live in a home with a TV. Okay, not a surprise there. 88% live in a home with a personal computer. So you know notice that's not as high as TV. 65% have internet access in their home. And as we're going to see in a minute, this is where we really see some socioeconomic status differences, that kids, there's a correlation. So the higher the income, the more likely they are to have access to these technologies. 95% of kids have a smartphone, and as we'll also see, that isn't as dependent on income. And then in general, teens spend about 9 hours a day on screen entertainment. I don't know why I put this. And then a total of 11 hours a day on screen media. I was looking at that stat and I thought, wait a minute, that's redundant, but it's not. So they spend 9 hours a day entertaining themselves, movies, music, that sort of thing. And then 11 hours a day, that extra 2 hours usually has to do with schoolwork or more educational kinds of technologies. Now in this chapter, I've put quite a few charts that I think are really good, so I just want to tell you the main things to notice from this. So this chart looks at who owns computers, phones, personal computers, and phones. So in general, up here, we've got 88% of teens say they have access to a computer in their home in general, and 95% a smartphone. We see there really aren't any sex differences. We start to see some differences, racial, ethnic differences here in a computer, but look, smartphone is pretty much the same all down the line. We can unequivocally say that most teens have a smartphone. Doesn't matter what their income level, where they're from, they have a smartphone. But computer, it's different. And then we see this goes up quite a bit as income rises in terms of, computer. And then it is generally related. Income generally is related to parents' education, so we see rises. So most teens have access to a computer, and pretty much all of them do to a phone. So they have the technology for sure. Okay, what about in their own bedrooms? This is another thing. So 71% of teens report that they have a TV in their bedrooms. 25% report that they have a computer, a laptop, and then 20% report that they have internet connection. Now, I will say that these stats are from maybe 5 years ago. I'm assuming that that is higher right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but this is where problems come. The recommendation of all of the mental health and the medical societies is for teenagers to make sure that all technology is being used within sight of their parents, in the living room, in a den, because once teenagers get into their own room with these technologies, parents don't know what they're doing, and it's pretty easy for kids to hide things. So the recommendation, and I'm sure many of you had these things in your bedrooms, and I'm not throwing shade at your parents or anything, but this is just the recommendation. We also know that there is a pretty decent correlation between teens' media use, and this is in their bedroom and off, between obesity levels and decreased sleep. So the more teens use media, spend time in the day looking at screens, the higher those rates and the worse the sleep rates, which are just, of course, overall important for overall health. Okay, how about phone use? Now, this survey I have is from 2010, but I looked at some recent statistics and they're really not that much different. They're not that much higher. So cell phones have been pretty much ubiquitous for the last 10 years or so. On average, teens spend, or rather text, I should say, over 3,000 texts a month. And this is even higher for girls. So for girls, they send over 4,000 texts a month, and that's been substantiated through different kinds of studies. So on average, this is around over 100 a day they send and receive texts, and then for girls it's even higher, 135. And then the studies also find that teens on average send and receive about 33 texts after they have gone to bed. So I know I've asked you before if you sleep with your phone near you or with you. So sleeping in the same bedroom as your phone, which a large portion of teens do, and I don't have those stats with me, tends to impede with a lot of things. And then we've got this statistic that just came out. 55% of teens admit, this might be somewhat below the line here of the cutoff. 55% of teens admit that they have texted while they have driven, which of course is incredibly problematic. Okay, let's look at some Some other statistics, what we're going to call sort of a virtually online constantly kind of thing. Almost half of teens say they're online almost all the time. So this is percent of teens who use the internet either on a computer or cell phone. So most recent stats just 2 years ago, about 45%. 44% say they're online several times a day, and less often than that, just a much smaller percentage, around 11%. Now look how different these numbers are from even 4 or 5 years ago. It was only 24% in 2014 who say that they're online almost constantly, and a greater majority several times a day. So what we're knowing from this is that teens are online a whole lot more than they used to be. Now that leads us to talking about a topic that you probably heard about, and that is cell phone addiction. So what is cell phone addiction? What does that mean? Now, if we look at the DSM, which is basically the manual we use to diagnose mental disorders, an addiction involves behavior. It's not how much you use a drug, how much you drink. It's what happens when you do. So it usually involves an addiction involves a disruption in your life somewhere, either in your relationships or your work or your school. It usually involves efforts to cut back unsuccessfully. It usually involves some withdrawal symptoms. So researchers have tried to put these same criteria to cell phone addiction, and this is not a formal diagnosis by any means. So a pretty recent statistic found that teens on average check their phones about 150 times a day. So this is 150 separate times a day they're looking at their phones to see notifications or whatnot. That amounts to about every 6 minutes. That's a lot of time. Now, given that some teens go to schools where they're not allowed to have their phones, this is an especially large amount of time before school and after school. This most recent survey found, now this is a different set of data, send an average of 150 texts a day. When we ask them, 50% report feeling addicted. So if we go back to this, those teens that are online almost constantly are probably more likely to admit, yeah, I think I'm addicted. And these findings come from the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2016. And that AAP is the premier medical organization for children and for teens. Now, what I've done here is link a really good video. It's a 7-minute video that I'd like you again to go to the unrecorded version and take a look at. It's a PBS video. And the 7 minutes is just part of a larger program on screenagers, but they talk about how they're finding that truly screen time activates centers of the brain that are responsible for similar kinds of actions as are responsible for drug addiction. So it's a really interesting thing I'd like you to go and take a look at and learn a little bit about. So they interview some teens and some parents, and then they talk to experts in neurobiology. So please go take a look at that. Okay, let's turn to the topic of social media use in teens, and we'll start off with a chart here. Now, similar to what the findings were from our class, I found that Instagram and Snapchat are some of the most popular online platforms. Facebook has dropped some. Twitter is still fairly popular, and then there are some lesser ones there. So the percentage of teens who say they're on YouTube is the majority, 85%. Most teenagers are on Instagram, most are on Snapchat, about half on Facebook. And then over where they say things they use most often, it looks like the two most common types of media teenagers use are Snapchat and YouTube, followed by Instagram and Facebook to a lesser extent. So these findings very much line up with what we found when we did the class survey. Now, as far as the effect on teenagers, here's another pretty good graph. It says teens have mixed views on social media's effect. So in that upper chart here, it says that about 31% of teens say social media has had a positive effect. About 45% said neutral, and then about a quarter say a mostly negative effect. So a quarter is quite a few. And those who said mostly negative, a large percentage say it's because of cyberbullying, because of the lack of contact, It creates distractions and some other things. And those who've said it's mostly positive have pointed out how it's a good way to connect with your friends and family. It's easier to find out things. It keeps you entertained. So nobody's slamming it all together. There certainly are some positives and negatives. And I think in the social sciences and psychology, we tend to make more of the negative effects, the worrisome effects, but I think it's worth noting that there are certainly some positive ones as well. Okay, moving on a little bit here. There have been quite a few studies done the last couple of years looking at what kinds of social media use are more harmful than others. And it used to be the thinking was, oh, social media always has the potential for harm. Well, that's true for everything. But they found that really the differences come from how you use social media. I think I may have mentioned this in class, but it's some really interesting work that finds that the biggest link in well-being is between passive social media use. So if you just scroll, if you don't comment, if you don't post on things, they have found that passive scrolling is associated with lower levels of well-being and life satisfaction. That tends to bring out the fear of missing out, the just feelings of inadequacy that people have, versus active use, posting, interacting with people, commenting on people's things, responding to people that comment on yours, did not show any declines, and in some studies showed an increase. And part of what's going on there is that we know that the more time that people spend interacting on social media, that's associated with more time spent with friends in real life. So the people that are on there, not passive but active, they're more likely to keep up their friendships in real life as well. So just something else to think about and keep in mind when you're using social media. Be active. It's going to be better for you. Now, what about college students and social media? This comes from a study done just a couple of years ago. Really interesting findings find that between 60 and 85%, that's the range, of social media postings by college students involve alcohol to some extent. Parties, showing themselves drinking, being with people that are drinking, and a lot of them are positive, and really most of them are positive portrayals. It's usually a partying kind of picture. But so this is where the research gets really interesting. Only about not even a third of people admit to having those postings. So when we ask students, hey, what percentage of your social media posts involve alcohol? A lot of them say, oh, hardly any, no, none. But the reality is that the majority, a large portion of them do involve alcohol to some extent. So kind of a contrast there. And we know that when students post about alcohol or postings that involve alcohol prior to going to college, so in high school, that has been a pretty decent predictor of binge drinking in college. So we know that drinking when you're an adolescent is more likely to be a predictor of binge drinking in college, and those postings are just really further evidence of that. One of the things that's been forwarded as an idea is because social media is so ubiquitous, so common among college students, maybe we can use it as a way for prevention of problems, mental health problems, alcohol, drug abuse problems, awareness. And so right now they're putting a lot of research into attempts to use that. So you'll see, for example, some public service announcements geared toward helping college students become aware and perhaps try and stop some problems before they start. Okay, well, what about total media exposure when we start looking at things all together combined? So on average, studies have found that kids between the age of 11 and 14 years spend about 60 hours a week on media. That includes music, that includes TV, videos, social media, everything. And then when they're a little bit older, it's around, not much, but around 56 hours per week. And the difference here seems to be that when kids are getting older, they are more likely to be in more activities, sports, extracurriculars that take time. They're more likely then to be working part-time jobs, and so they have less time to be watching TV. And on average, they only spend about a half an hour reading per day, so not much, and that usually involves schoolwork. Is reading on a screen count? If it's textbook or educational related, yes, it does, but that's not as common. And then some really recent research has found that the kids who are the heaviest users of screen time and media users have a 27% greater likelihood to deal with depression or to struggle with depression. So what we're saying here is that media use is common among teenagers. In moderate uses, it doesn't seem to be having any ill effects, but what we're concerned about are the teenagers who are using a lot of it. We know that it certainly affects grades and GPA. A study done a few years ago found that there is a correlation, a negative correlation between media use and GPA. So the higher the media use of a teenager, the lower their GPA is going to be. And then the more that teenagers read and listened to music, that tended to be correlated with higher levels of GPA. So there are certain activities that teenagers can do that are associated with higher levels of their grade point average. Okay, well, let's move on to the topic of computer games, one that certainly shows a lot of controversy, and there's just tons and tons of research on it, and most of it pretty definitive. There's definitely a conflict to some extent that's out there. There are some researchers who are saying that computer games are not harmful to teens, others that are saying it is. So I just want to present you some of the evidence, and then because we're encouraging critical thinking, give you the opportunity to think about this for yourself and make some decisions for yourself. So we know that computer games are obviously extremely popular. Around 70 to 75% of teens play computer video games. And if you're thinking, wow, I thought it was higher, pretty much everybody I know does. Remember, girls tend to play less, and so they pull that average down. We're going to look in a minute and say that the majority of boys do, but girls pull that average down. Between the ages of 8 and 18, they play an average of 50 minutes a day, and that's especially boys. Now that's typically during the school year. That might seem low to you, but again, you've got lots of people who aren't playing anything that are pulling that average down. And then about 56% are playing about 2.5 hours a day. So we've got about half that are playing over 2.5 hours a day. These little boys here are just cracking me up. Another chart, a couple more charts here. Most teen boys and girls do play video games. So when we look at the percentage of those that have access to a gaming console, we've got most girls and definitely the vast majority of boys, and those that play video games. We've got about 97% for boys and 83% for girls. And then 41% of teen boys say they spend too much time playing video games, which shows an interesting level of awareness in my mind. I'm surprised that they have that much awareness. So about 41% say they think they play about the right time. My guess is that their parents might disagree with that. And then 14% say, no, I could play more. And then of course we're girls, we see the majority say they don't play much or they play about the right time. So there definitely seem to be some gender differences here. Now, I want to make the point, even though we're going to talk about some of the research that's been problematic, video games by themselves are not inherently bad. There's a man named Craig Anderson who is the guru of researching on the effects of video games, and he has found a lot of negative effects of them. And I've heard him at a couple of conferences speak, and he said that he gets death threats, he gets hate mail all the time, and he says, one of the things he said to us was, I love video games. I love playing video games. I control it, but I love them, but I'm worried about them, and that's really the interest there. So he's not trying to paint the video games as the bad thing. It's how they are used and who they are used by. So not all games are created the same. There are some perfectly harmless games and some games that will actually increase quite a few skills, as we'll see. But there are some that have some problems. So let's start with the positive news here. That's probably a good idea. So these effects include, among other things, increased spatial skills, better spatial skills, visual spatial skills, and also fine motor coordination. There are a number of games, even some of the active shooter games, which are the most problematic, that really help with these kinds of skills. And this Craig Anderson that I was just telling you about, he was saying that there's a pretty decent correlation between the prowess that surgeons have. So the better surgeons tend to play video games. And so his suggestion was, if you have to have a surgery, ask your surgeon if they play video games, because if they do, they're probably a better surgeon. Isn't that interesting? So anyway, it's a chicken and egg thing. We don't know if because they have good techniques, they want to play video games, or if it helps them, but whatever. There's an association between the two. And we also know that some of these games can facilitate social relationships, especially obviously the multiplayer games. You can be hooked up with your friends. That's exactly what my son is doing now. He doesn't talk with strangers over his games, but he and his friends all join the game and they hoot and holler and scream and just have a great time. So that's how he gets his socialization for the most part. Now, when it comes to some of the issues with games, the finding is that only about less than 20% of teens report that their parents check the ratings on games. So a lot of the games have this rating scale here, and many teenagers report that their parents just don't pay any attention to it. Almost half reported that when they were between the ages of 13 and 16, they were able to purchase M-rated games, which you're not supposed to be able to do. And then 100% of the M-rated games require the player to injure other characters. So most of the M-rated games are really the ones that we're concerned about, the first-person shooter and some of the other more graphic ones. When we looked at the best-selling video games of 2019 last year, Call of Duty was #1, which is certainly one of the most violent video games. Mortal Kombat, also a very violent one, was bestseller #5, and then Grand Theft Auto has really dropped. That was down to #11. But Grand Theft Auto in particular is problematic because it tends to have all kinds of racist and sexist and just all kinds of messages. And there are some other games from the past that were just really had some bad themes, like Postal in particular. One of the games required the player to shoot at a high school marching band walking by. So just really terrible messages on some of them. So what we're concerned about is aggression. Do violent video games cause aggression in kids? And the first important thing to remember is that there is no single factor that causes youth to be aggressive. Youth that are aggressive, teenagers that are aggressive, this is a complicated matter. It's a complicated question, and it involves all kinds of both biological and psychological factors. So there is no one single factor. We cannot point our finger at video games and say that's the cause. There are multiple causes. But the video games are a contributor. So let me tell you about a couple important studies. The Anderson that I just mentioned to you, and Brad Bushman. Brad Bushman is a researcher just down the road here at Ohio State, and he and Anderson are really leading the way in studying the effects of video games. And Bushman's a really interesting character. I've heard him speak as well. He's also a fan of video games. So neither of these guys, Anderson or Bushman, they're not trying to get rid of video games. They just have some concerns about them. But in this study, what they found is that the level of aggression and hostility and anxiety that is displayed by teenagers after they play a video game increases with the level of violence. So the more violent a video game, the higher these levels of aggression, hostility, and anxiety. This is from, I think, God of War or something like that. A couple other studies. Anderson, a little bit earlier in 2010, this was a bigger, more widespread study, finds that violent video games tend to lead to increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive feelings, aggressive thoughts, and then also a decrease in prosocial behavior. So he's done studies that are really interesting, like they'll have teenagers and young adults, college students, in playing a video game. Some will play a violent video game, others will play a non-violent video game. And then they will stage a fight outside the room. So the researcher and the subject is in a room and he or she is playing, they are playing the video game. And then they'll hear a fight outside the room, which is, they don't know it's a pretend fight. So what the researchers were interested in is how many of them will leave the game and go and try and intervene, see if everybody was okay. And they find that the kids, the people who are playing the violent video games, are significantly less likely to go check it out and see if they can help. And that's like in the moment happening. Really interesting. Anderson also did just a little bit more recently found that playing a violent video game tends to increase desensitization to real life violence. So what this means is when you play violent video games a fair amount, you are not as affected by real violence. You see about a crime or some violence on TV, and you are just not as moved. It just doesn't seem to bother you as much. So that's a really troublesome possible effect of that. Okay, this slide, particular slide, again, this is a pretty good news clip about some of this information we've just been talking about. So when you go on Blackboard to the unrecorded lectures, go ahead and please take a look at that quick video clip. Just a little bit more research here on video games I want to mention. This was from 2016, found that not all teens are affected the same by video games. The ones that we are the most concerned about of being affected by video games are those who perhaps are dealing with some depression, some severe moodiness, some more extreme anxiety. So moody, impulsive, unfriendly teens are the most affected. They tend to show the highest levels of anxiety after playing a video game. So one of the things that tells us is that it's not making them feel better, it's making them feel worse. And it's the competition part that seems to be the most influential. So people tend to point to the killing and the shooting, but it's that competitive, I got to shoot more people than you, I got to kill more people than you. That's the part that seems to increase the hostility the most. Really interesting. Okay, just a little bit more evidence, and if you're freaking out a little bit thinking, does she expect us to know all these studies and names in these years? The answer is no. I want you to understand just in general, because a lot of this research is in agreement, just what kinds of things are being found. So just a couple of more. A longitudinal study done in 2012, which is really what we need. We need longitudinal studies which show us the long-term effects of some of these things. Found that frequent game playing tended to lead to risky driving behaviors. So whether the kids who played games have certain characteristics that make them risky drivers, or whether the whether the game playing led to the risky driving, I can't talk tonight. We don't know, but there's clearly an association between the two from this and a couple other studies. And then one final study here, this one was done a few years ago as well, found that violent games tend to actually increase stress for kids and increase aggression. So there used to be a thought that there was something called catharsis. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but that's the idea that video games relieve stress, that you feel better after doing something. That's catharsis. Something makes you feel better. So running is cathartic. It makes you feel better. There has been absolutely no evidence finding that video games is cathartic. Even though you'll have kids tell you, oh, I find it relaxing, they do not find that it relieves the stress that kids have, particularly violent video games. Also in the same study, there was a finding that frequent use or frequent video game playing leads to decreased levels of empathy and greater acceptability of violence. So you can see this theme developing here. It tends to make kids feel more hostile, more aggressive. Violence is a more acceptable way to solve problems. And then most of these studies have been done with boys. Studies that have been separate looking at girls finds that when girls play with their parents, like play a video game with their parents, that tends to increase positive behaviors and family connection. And I'm not sure if that's been replicated in boys as well. Boys tend to play video games less with their families than girls do. But if it's a game that is not violent, it tends to have more positive effects. The last thing I want to show here just about specific things with video games, it's this signs of video game addiction. And again, this is not a certifiable diagnosis. This is just something that the mental health experts have come up with to kind of warn people about it. So these are some of the signs of other sorts of addiction. So interfering in your life, disrupting your sleep, disrupting school or work. This is the tolerance, needing to play longer to get enjoyment, feeling irritable if you can't play or can't use in the addiction literature, feeling anxious when you're not playing, being consumed about thoughts. Playing more than 6 hours a week, I would take that off there because people can play for more than that and not not have this dependence on it. So those are just some things to think about when assessing. So in conclusion here, Craig Anderson points out that the smoking analogy to the effects of video games, the idea that if you have one cigarette, it's not going to cause lung cancer. The more cigarettes you smoke, the more likely you are to get lung cancer. The same with video games. Playing a video game once in a while isn't going to give you problems. The more video games you play, and especially the more violent ones you play, the more likely there are to be problems. So there is a cumulative effect on aggression. We're worried about this building up over time. I just mentioned that they have debunked the catharsis hypothesis, the idea that video games make people feel better. They don't seem to have that, particularly for violent video games. And then the bottom line, the last point, is that we really need a lot more studies on this topic. Longitudinal studies. This is an important area because obviously this isn't an activity that's going to be going away anytime soon. All right, the last topic in this chapter under subculture that we're going to talk about is television, TV, and I think we could probably include movies in there also, but especially TV shows. And because of the wider availability of TV shows through streaming, the researcher kind of moved away from TV and more toward video games, but because of streaming and that availability, it's starting to move back toward that a little bit. So I just want to mention a couple of things about TV. Even though a lot of people get their entertainment from their computer and from things like YouTube, TVs are still very popular. 70% of the American population has over 3 TVs in their household. And then half have what's called a constant TV environment. In other words, the TV is always on, whether somebody's watching it or not. And what that tells us, even if nobody's watching it, it just tells us the importance of TV. And they know that there's also a high percentage of people who have the TV on during meals. We know that there are definitely socioeconomic status effects here. People who are lower socioeconomic status tend to have the TV on more and watch more TV shows and are more likely to have it on during meals than people of middle or upper. And they also tend to have fewer books. So that's something, there's a lot of community-based and school-based programs that are trying to really work with that to teach people the importance of turning off the TV and giving them access to books. So lots of studies that have looked at TV shows and the effects of them, and recent analyses of the top 10 shows on TV found that about a quarter of them contain sexual content, about 60% contain violent content, and the studies find that teenagers witness 10,000 acts of violence a year on TV, and a quarter of those violent acts use guns. So teenagers are seeing a heck of a lot of violence on TV. There's the shows like the CSI and the Blue Bloods and all those kinds of shows, certainly the Law and Order, they're still incredibly popular. They keep making more of them. And now because of things like Netflix and some of the other streaming services, they can actually ratchet up the levels of violence because those are subscriber and they don't have to worry about meeting the main network rules for some of their decency rules and violence rules. As far as the content of alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, about 70% of primetime dramas like CSI contain those, and about 10% of commercials that teenagers see are commercials that involve alcohol. Now, when it comes to looking at the effects of violent TV on behavior, which is where all the research was, of course, before it moved to video games, so far that they have just found correlations only. So we can't make statements that violent TV actually causes problems in kids. But we do know that watching a lot of violent TV, and sometimes parents will start letting their kids watch violent TV from a really young age. I mean, these adult shows, these are meant for late teenagers on up, but I know lots of cases of 6, 7, 8-year-olds that are watching these shows. It's just hard to understand. So they have found that watching a fair amount of these shows can lead to an increased fear of violence. So the world is represented to kids on TV. They don't know any better to know that the world doesn't work like that. And so they begin to fear that the world is actually a pretty scary, violent place because that's the representation that they are seeing on TV. We also know that it leads to a heightened tolerance of violence. So when kids hear about violent kinds of things, it doesn't really seem to bother them as much or affect them as much. We also know that it leads to a desensitivity to the effect of violence on others. And this is just a continuation of the previous point, really. You become kind of immune to the effects of violence in real life, which, of course, we don't want any human being to be. Okay, a little bit about TV and binge watching. I'm somewhat out of order here in my notes, but still sticking with TV. You know, this is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the research. They're only just starting to take a look at what the effects of this are. But I just want to tell you about one study I read about that was really interesting. Found that there's a correlation between the amount of binge watching TV a person does, a teenager does, and their levels of stated loneliness and depression. So because it's a correlation, what we're saying here is that binge watching doesn't cause those factors, but the more a person binge watches, the higher their loneliness and depression. So that's just something to keep in mind. We have to look at the other factors that might be involved. These might be people that live alone. These might be people who are not in relationships, who are a little more socially isolated. We don't exactly know what else is involved, but there is a correlation. Okay, so just kind of back to screen violence and youth behavior here. That was sort of a pause. Um, I'm going to kind of backtrack away from TV and do some concluding comments here about screen violence and youth behavior. So we're talking less about TV and more on just some of the things they would see on video games, and really some of the other kinds of shows and things that they watch. So we know that there have been experimental studies done on that, and it supports that exposure to violent media does cause immediate aggression. So I realize I sound like I'm contradicting myself about the effects of violent TV when I say that there are correlations only. These things are looking more at movies, more at video games, and also more at music videos, I should say. So for example, some of the long-term concerns that we have about this, how do I advance my screen? Some of the long-term concerns we have, and this is from a little bit of an older study, found that 8 to 10-year-olds who had a lot of violent media exposure, and these were usually through the form of video games and some adult TV shows, were twice as likely to have assaulted a spouse by the age of 25. That's a really startling statistic, and some of the follow-up research that's looked longitudinal has found supporting. So we know that violent media exposure, the younger a child begins to be exposed to violent media exposure, the more potential harm that could come of it. Now, I mentioned to you at the beginning, there's a lot of controversy about this. You'll see there's one researcher whose last name is Ferguson, Chris Ferguson, I think his name is, who absolutely denies all of this, that says it's, to coin a phrase, fake news and it's all being blown out of proportion. So Anderson and Bushman have looked at why people tend to deny these effects of the media that we're seeing when the science is right there in front of your face. The first thing is, the speculation is that they don't really understand statistics very well. So it's really common for people who don't believe these statistics to say something like, well, I play violent video games and I've never killed anyone. Well, let's take a look at that. The percentage of people who kill someone else is really low. Statistically, hardly anybody ever does that. So for example, for the FBI always lists the 8 big crimes that are committed by people, and only 0.1% are murders. People do other things. So murder is statistically rare, and school shootings are even more rare. So when we're looking at information about violent behaviors, they are rare and they're hard to predict. But we know that the people who do, there may be an association with violent video games? This, again, it's a really complex kind of question, but the people who deny these things just don't really understand how statistics work. And we're dealing with rare numbers anyway, but of the rare people who do that, there is a relationship. We also know people deny the media effects because of cognitive dissonance, something called cognitive dissonance reduction. And this comes back to, okay, I play video games and I haven't hurt anybody, or no, there's nothing wrong with me. Well, oftentimes when people hear these statistics and they play video games, it makes them feel a little bit bad about themselves or their behaviors. That creates cognitive dissonance. I'm doing something I enjoy, but yet it's bad for me. So to reduce the cognitive dissonance, people will downplay the research that they hear. That's kind of classic reducing cognitive dissonance. We also know people deny those media effects because of something called the third person effect. The third person effect is where we tend to believe things only happen to other people. So, other people don't floss their teeth but have dental problems, but I can do that and it's going to be fine. Other people play video games and they have problems, but I can do that and it's going to be fine. So it's basically a bias that people have. And then the last factor is the effect of psychological reactance. And psychological reactance is the reaction many people have that, oh, they're just trying to ban violent video games. They're just trying to take our video games from us. The belief is that we just don't want kids to play, like we don't want them to smoke and we don't want them to drink. And that's not it at all. People are responding to the potential of loss of freedom. And so when that happens, they try harder to get it. It's one of the reasons why teenagers tend to drink when they're when they're banned from drinking. You try harder to get something that you're being prevented from. So the way to think about it for those people who deny the effects of this, we know that living in a home where people are hurting each other is detrimental for kids. It causes psychological pain. It causes problems. Witnessing violence is harmful for kids. So when we think about video games, how can anyone spend 9 hours a day on anything and not have it affect them? So we've got a kid who's playing video games or watching, violent shows for many hours a day. How in the world do we think it's not going to affect them? That's really the best argument. If we said to parents, what if your kid was eating candy for every single meal? Do you think it would affect them? Well, sure, it would affect them. Okay, then they're playing these games for 9 hours a day. You think it's not going to have an effect? And one of the things we know it does from a neurological standpoint is it decreases prefrontal lobe cortex activity. And as we've talked about, that's a key structure of the brain that's developing in adolescence and doesn't really finish until early 20s or so. So it may seem to interfere with that, which is problematic. So finally, to end this, let's talk about a couple of recommendations that we have for teenagers, for parents, for caregivers. First of all, it's important to watch kids play games and watch TV programs with them. So accompanying kids, especially young teens, when they don't really understand the world, they don't understand how that person's a good guy, but they have a gun, and etc. Talking with them about the programs has been found to be helpful. Limit the amount of entertainment screen time that kids have. The American Academy of Pediatrics, of course, for kids, they recommend no screen time prior to the age of 2, except for like video chatting with relatives. And then after the age of 2, they recommend a maximum of an hour a day, and I think it's 2 hours a day for teenagers. So they recommend parents stick to that. Keep devices out of the bedrooms. I've already mentioned that, but it leaves less room for parent surveillance and can lead to some problems. Monitor teens' media use. This is a big one. There's all kinds of apps that parents can use and install, kind of that they can watch what their kids are doing. They can set permissions, put all those security controls on your teen's phone, and that will help. And there's all kinds of reports about how, teens can get around it, etc. But the more parents know, the better off they're going to be. And then really role model good screen use for teens. They have found that parents' screen use is a pretty strong predictor predictor of how much their kids and their teens use screens. So if the parent is texting and looking things up on their phone at meal times, if they can't look up from their phone to have a conversation with their kid, how can they expect their kid to behave in a similar way? So that's absolutely social cognitive theory right there. Monkey see, monkey do, essentially. So all right, that's it for this chapter, and I will see you in the next chapter for family relationships.